Hello and welcome to Groundworks. This is a second episode for the RemoteTech 2 mod series. In the previous episodes we have covered the most common mistakes new players make when playing with RemoteTech, and we have also shown a little bit of GUI. In today's episode we will be talking in general about relay networks, why do we need them, explain a little bit how does the proper setup look up from the GUI perspective in the map view, and also we will cover how to build a communication satellite that would be able to cover the whole Kerbin system, covering planet Kerbin and its Mun and Minmus. So in front of us, as you can see, we have the map view, and I have already set up communications network, and I can show it to you here. It looks pretty complex, but it's actually quite simple. The main point of a relay network is to maintain 100% signal coverage of your RemoteTech probe on its ascent to the orbit and all the orbital maneuvers and going to Mun, Minmus and wherever you want it to go, while constantly maintaining a connection back to the Kerbal Space Center so that you can actually steer it. So that's actually why you would need a relay network. There are many ways how you can set up a relay network, but in this guide I have chosen to have 3 satellites as tips of an equilateral triangle. So you can see this Kerbin communication satellite 1, 2 and 3 in the tips, and how are they maintaining a connection I will show you through the activation of my Kerbin Carbonite Biome Scanner, which is a satellite in the polar orbit. Since it's in a high above North Pole, it doesn't have a constant connection to the Kerbin Space Center. So, as you can see, the signal is currently being relayed by a Kerbin short-range communication satellite number 2. And this is also the function of the first icon in the GUI. So when you press it, you will always see active connections. And this is regardless whether you're using omnidirectional satellite antennas from within the Kerbin orbit, or for example, if I would select my Minmus satellite, it will also show that it is maintaining a constant connection to the Kerbal Space Center. So, as you can see here, this is the first. So the first icon covers the active connection. The second icon in the GUI, when you activate it, it looks actually like a big mess. But actually it shows the cone of coverage. So if you zoom out, it starts making sense. Now I have a total of 3 communication satellites that you can see above Kerbin, 1, 2 and 3. And all of them are designed so that they use omni antennas while in the orbit around Kerbin, but to have also a total of 3 directional antennas, so directional dishes, and one of them would be always pointed to my active craft, second would be pointing to Mun, as you can see, and the third one would be pointing to Minmus. And this is exactly what this second icon does. It shows the coverage for those directional antennas. So if you look from the perspective of Mun, you have satellite 1 covering it with its arc of coverage. Then you have second. And then you have third arc of coverage here. And the same thing goes to Minmus. Those 3 satellites, this is the way how those 3 satellites are covering the whole Kerbin system. And the same rule applies for my Minmus probe. So if you look from the perspective of the Minmus probe, it only has one antenna that's pointing back to the Kerbin, and you can see its cone of coverage covers more than enough to be able to cover the place where the 3 communication satellites in the Kerbin orbit are. So it looks pretty complex, but if you just enable to see the actual dish connections, you will notice that icon number 3 shows, when it's pointed to this little dish here, it shows potential connections towards communication satellite that can relay signal back to Kerbin. So while the first one maintains an active connection, so you can see the green one is the active one, and these yellow 3 ones are indicating redundancy basically. And you need redundancy, for example, if the original satellite runs out of power, goes into the shadow, whatever, you want to maintain a connection and you want to have a second satellite that you can easily bounce your signal from. The mod does that automatically for you, provided that it has the satellites to connect to. So if we go back to our carbonite biome scanner, you can see here a clear picture on how all of this is working out. So connections with the dishes and omnidirectional satellites. Now, when you want to go to an interplanetary communication setup, the rules are pretty much the same. I will show you how do these communication satellites look. So let's go and check them out, shall we? So if you can observe here, you can see this communication satellite is very simple. It has a probe core, it has some batteries on the inside, it has some fuel to get to the orbit, some solar panels, and communication dishes, omni and directional. I will show you how to build this satellite in a few minutes, but this is what it looks like and how it should be pointed, obviously towards the sun. Now let us examine the interplanetary communications network setup. Okay, here as you can see we have a similar setup. 3 satellites in orbit and also 1 communication station in a low Kerbin orbit, which is acting as an interplanetary relay for the communication networks towards Duna. Now, when communicating to Duna, if you remember, we were showing the cone of coverage for each of these small satellites, and those here that you can see are covering Minmus. Now, if we zoom out, you can see this other cone of coverage, and this cone of coverage is coming from my Duna communication satellite. So if we go to the Duna communication satellites, we can see them here. Duna ComSat 1. You can see them also communicating back to Kerbin. The setup, 3 satellites in the orbit, is exactly the same. The only difference is that I'm using, for the communication between Duna and Kerbin, I'm using a bigger dishes. So although the dish which I shown in the first tutorial had too narrow cone of coverage, I've shown it when pointing to Moon, the same dish on a much grander distance, this cone of coverage is more than enough to cover Duna and all of its planets. Now, deploying this interplanetary satellites is a bit more complex, and I can just briefly show you the craft which I used to deploy it. but I will be going into more detail on how to do it in probably episode 3 or 4. Alright, this is my deploying craft, and I can just rotate so you can see it a little bit better. It's a space plane, actually a single stage to orbit space plane, powered by RemoteTech Propulsion, and inside, in its hangar, it used to house a total of 4 of these communication satellites mapped to its docking ports, as you can see here. So I would fly it basically with all 4 satellites to Duna and then set them in roughly the same orbit and make sure that they are properly deployed. So now, without further ado, let me show you how to actually build communication satellites. Okay, so as I've highlighted below, I will show you how to make a communication satellite. This is what it looks like. This is actually a stock version, and this is the one that I will show you how to build. First, you will need a probe core. Then, secondly, you will need a communications antenna. Now, I prefer to use Communotron 32 as opposed to the Communotron 16 simply because of its longer range. Now, when we select it, I put it on the top. Here. And this one is, in my opinion, much better to use since it has much bigger range. It has 5 million meters as opposed to the Communotron stock 16 2.5, which means you can deploy the satellites higher in the orbit. So if you would be using Communotron 16, you can deploy 3 satellites in 750 kilometer orbit, which leaves you a very small margin for error. So the satellites need to be placed exactly, and the timings between them has to be very, very precise. If you use Communotron 32, as I'm suggesting, you can deploy it at almost twice as high in the orbit, which leaves you much bigger room for, or much bigger margin for error, basically. So the second thing you want to add is some batteries. Since the antenna will draw power, you will need some batteries to maintain that power, to actually hold the electric charge. And here, to determine how much actually batteries do you need, I'm using another interesting mod, which is called Fuse Box, which you can see here. It's very useful because it calculates the total power requirements of all of the components that you use on your satellite or a spacecraft. And based on where you plan to deploy them, it tells you roughly how many batteries would you need. So, first you press the darkness time and then you say, okay, I want to deploy my satellite in the orbit of Kerbin, and I want to deploy it at 1,500 kilometers. And then it tells me this would approximately equate to darkness time of 15 minutes and 38 seconds. Now, with the current antenna that I'm using, the Communotron 32, and these batteries, it says drain is 0.63, meaning with the current batteries that I have, it will reach 0 in 16 minutes and 11 seconds. And normally this should be enough if I only use Communitron 32. But if you remember from when I showed you the satellite, I was using 3 more dishes, and those are directional dishes, so comms, DTS, M1. And the reasoning behind using 3, as I've shown before, would be that one of them would be covering the active craft, second would be covering Mun, and third would be covering Minmus. So now, since I have added these 3 communication dishes, you notice that my batteries would be drained in roughly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. So that simply means we need to add more batteries. And I would typically add, let's say, 1 or 2 more, and also probably 2 of the bigger ones. Let's see, how much would this be? And yeah, then it says it is roughly 16 minutes and 14 seconds, which is slightly more than we need. But then I guess this is alright, since we might be adding lights and some other things which will also drain the batteries. Okay, so we have added antennas and we have added batteries that hold the electric charge to power those antennas. Now the next thing we need is actually solar panels, because those solar panels would actually be recharging these batteries when the craft is in sunlight. And typically I would select 3 of the 1x6 photovoltaic panels and put them in roughly 30 degrees. And as you can see, those 3 photovoltaic panels should be more than enough to provide enough power for this satellite. Now the next thing which we need to add is the fuel, because this satellite has to get to a specific orbit. And we will do so by selecting a small fuel tank. This is almost the smallest one that is actually practical, and a small Rocomax engine at the bottom. This should give the satellite thrust to weight ratio of around 3 and 2330 delta V, which is usually more than enough to put it into any orbit around Kerbin which we would need. However, this engine can be a little bit impractical and tedious when you want to very fine-tune your orbit. So what I would suggest is also that you add is some reactional thrusters, also known as RCS, to your satellite, and also some RCS fuel. They are very convenient because you do not need to here I will put just one more RCS tank at the bottom. They're very convenient because if you do a little bit overboard and you go too high on the orbit, you don't need to turn your satellite around to make another burn, because they can burn forward, back, and basically all directions. So that makes them very convenient. Also, in this game can get pretty dark in space, so what I would typically add is some small lights, and I put them in non-symmetry whatsoever, 90 degrees angle, and put them on the sides, with one of them being light red on the left hand side and green on the other. This is purely for cosmetic reasons, but it adds a lot of the atmosphere of the game. So this is how you make a communication satellite. And this is how you make a stock communication satellite. Now I will show you one other satellite that I have built using a different mod called Near Future Electrical. It is basically the same satellite, but aesthetically, to me, it's a little bit more pleasing. As you can see, it's a little bit smaller, and I'm simply have replaced the whole bunch of batteries which you saw in the original one with one compact battery from the mod. This is the only difference between those two satellites. I just think it looks cooler. Okay, and in the next section we will be covering on how to get these satellites into orbit. What craft do you need to use? However, we will show you this in the next episode. Thank you very much for watching, and if you like the video, do like the video. This is Gromforks signing off.